And hello and welcome to Auspol Explained. I am your host, David, as always, and this is indeed, hopefully, a live stream that is working, despite the fact that I do actually do live streams occasionally for my job previously as a videographer. YouTube always challenges me, but hey, I'm 31 now, so I think that is just part of the course, you know? You get a little bit older, things get difficult. So I'm here to basically just answer any questions that anyone might have about Australian politics and whatnot. So, just to start off, as people trickle in, I just want to tell you about what I've been working on lately, which is an upcoming video about, upcoming episode about the role and power of the monarchy in Australia, because King Charles III, his coronation is on the 6th of May. I'm very excited. I've invited friends around to my house for that, to watch it live. Oh, hello, Ninja Man Away. Thank you so much for using my videos to teach Year 5 and 6 class. I realize now, you know, when I started this, I was just like, I want to do deep dives and get really into explaining politics. And now I've realized that the 25 long minute videos are not the best actually for explaining lots of concepts to lots and lots of people. So I do actually intend to make like shorter ones, like 5-minute ones, let's be honest, 7-minute ones, 8-minute ones that sort of deal with concepts that I've gone over, but like in a more efficient way. So if you have any requests for things that you'd like a 5-minute explainer for your class, I will gladly do that. I need to make shorter explainers. My videos are too long. Yeah. But yeah, who is excited about the King's coronation? I got a question from Alex about by-elections. Are there any rules about how close they can be to a normal full election? I love it when people ask me questions because it's an opportunity for me to learn, and the answer is I don't actually know the answer to that one. I'm sure there is a rule. I just cannot tell you what the time limit is. There are rules about like the frequencies of elections. You know, like if someone resigns or dies or whatever, there's a casual vacancy like 3 weeks out before an election. Like you're not going to have a by-election for that. I think. I honestly don't know what the time limit is, but I do know that like some people do deliberately quit just before elections because in upper houses, so for the Senate and like Legislative Council in some states, not all of them, Western Australia doesn't do this, there are half elections because the upper house term is longer than the lower house. So I believe Mark Latham actually quit just before the most recent New South Wales election or something, so he could get a longer term, because it's like, oh, you know, I'm going to have a half election, I'm halfway through my term, if I resign now and then run again, that means if I get re-elected, which is a gamble, I will have another 8 years. Pardon me, I think it's 8 years for the New South Wales, it's 6 years for senators. I don't know the answer to your question, Alex. Thank you for that. I will look that up. But I love improvising something different to what you asked that is tangentially relevant, because I am full of fun facts. Not that one. Like Tony Abbott said, no one is the suppository of all wisdom and knowledge. And I'm definitely not the suppository of all wisdom and knowledge, unfortunately. I'd like to know more. Thank you to a different Alex in the chat for confirming that it's 8 years. That would make sense. States have fixed 4-year terms, with the exception of one of them, I can't recall, but not every single state, I believe, has like fixed 4-year terms at this point. I feel like there's one holding out that hasn't done that yet. Yeah. Federally, we can't have a fixed 4-year term unless we have a referendum. But no one seems to want to have a referendum on that, so we're going to have a referendum on the voice. Does anyone have any questions about the Indigenous voice to parliaments? Because that one, I've seen a lot of misinformation about that one, and it's never too early to learn more and more about the voice, right? Some quick fire myths to bust. It's not a legislative body. It's not. It's not a legislative body. It's not a third chamber. That is not its purpose or intention, and cannot actually be its purpose or intention in the future. Legislative power rests in the monarch, King Charles III, and his representatives, as well as the Senate and House of Representatives federally. And as we are not changing Section 1 of the Constitution, we are having a proposed additional section of 129. The voice to Parliament cannot be a legislative body. It can only be an advisory body. So, if you know anyone who is concerned about that, feel free to tell them exactly what I just said. There is, if they ask you for like, hey, what's your proof? You could be like, well, I just heard how the Constitution works. It's right there at the start, Section 1. Once you leave the covering clauses, we're talking about legislative power. The voice is not going to be mentioned in there. Ta-da. So, yes, that is a, myth number 1. Neat. I am working on a sort of myths and facts about the Indigenous voice referendum coming up, but because King Charles III's coronation is coming up in like 2 weeks, I want to prioritize that one. Whereas the referendum doesn't actually have a date set, but it will be sometime in the next several months. It has to be more than 2 months away, because unless I have somehow lived under a rock and no one in my entire social media feed has alerted me to the fact that the referendum bill has passed, it still has to be at least 2 months away. Okay, a question about the voice referendum. Where will the voice be physically located if it does get created? That's a great question. So the thing is that the voice is a malleable thing, and it doesn't necessarily need to have a physical place. Now, the sort of proposal currently is to sort of divide Australia into sort of 35 areas that are local groups based off consultation with the community and government of those areas to come up with those 35 areas and use that. So it's kind of creating an element of, I don't want to say local government because it's not like government, but there are local areas that will comprise the body that sends people to the voice, and then I don't know if they'll have a physical structure to meet. Local councils, for example, they don't have parliament buildings, they have sort of council houses, just meeting rooms, are pretty, they can be switched out for other rooms, so I don't know about any sort of physical structure. There presumably will be office spaces provided for some sort of central communication or multiple office buildings. That's one of the really difficult things, is that that's a technical logistical thing for that is not something that necessarily needs to have a definitive answer, because it can just change when they're like, oh, our lease in this office is up, we'll go to another one. But an important part is understanding that the voice is going to involve local groups across all of Australia, and the sort of base model does involve representation, dedicated representation for remote communities across the different states and territories to ensure that it is not centralized based off population, like, New South Wales. So many people live in Sydney, or, well, the states in general. Lots of people live in the capital cities, and so that's where you get most of your representation for lower houses, for example, whereas The Voice has dedicated representation for regional and remote communities to ensure that it has a diverse perspective to bring. Okay, next question. I hope that was a satisfying answer. Mike Hitch asked, how can the Governor-General not know what the point of the Westminster system's purpose is? I don't know, they just didn't research it. I don't know what that's in reference to. I don't actually know what training the Governor-General gets. Presumably some. There must be someone teaching the Governor-General, this is how your job works. Like members of Parliament, for example, you can come from any sort of background. Like we recently, is it Stephen Bates who was working at an Apple store? Like a retail worker, you wouldn't really expect to know much about the inner mechanics of parliamentary procedure. And there is a training video for elected members of Parliament. There are training sessions where it's like, this is how it works. This is the book that you referred to. So there is presumably someone, I don't know who would do that for the Governor-General. But yeah, I don't know what you're referring to specifically, if you have a critique of a specific Governor-General. But yeah, there are definitely people in Parliament who do the job as is described to them. And I've met people who work in Parliament, not necessarily members, who this role has a historic sort of background to it. The current Sergeant-at-Arms at West Australian State Parliament loves learning about the history of the role. And I don't really know if that's relevant to just the current, mechanics of the day-to-day job, because, who cares if the symbol of the mace was to issue warrants of arrest without having to rely on people being able to read, because that's not how it works anymore. So, anyway, I'm just I spend too much time talking. I'm just waiting for more questions to roll in. So Ninja Man Away, the coronation is a Saturday. So that day specifically is not a public holiday. I believe it is going to be a public holiday in the UK. I don't know if it will be a public holiday here. It's probably decisions of the individual states. And last I read, they were it was a maybe. So I don't know, but it feels like at this point, if they haven't announced it, it might be a bit late to do it. I don't know. It would be nice. I love a good public holiday. I'm just going to adjust my lights because it's shining in my eyes too much. Politics, by the way, to follow up on Ninja Man Away's next question. I did not study politics at uni. I studied film. Everyone gets sort of shocked at that, but I just got just really, really interested in politics. And then people kept asking me the same questions about politics. I was like, I'm going to devote my time to actually having a body of work for people to use, a resource to help them understand things. So yeah, I'm just literally just this passionate about this thing. And the great thing is, when people ask me questions that I don't know, like Alex's question about by-election rules, I will go look it up. I promise you, I will do that. I will find an answer to that one. I just love learning. Emma asks that about the difference between state and territory rights. What can't territories do? Well, it's basically states, right? States created the federal government because they were the original 6 British colonies. They got together and they're like, hey, we want to form together into a commonwealth. We'll become states of that commonwealth, but we also then what is the relationship? What's the dynamic? And so they wrote into the Constitution, this is what the Commonwealth can do. This is how it interacts with states. And these are the protections for us, right? So one of those is like this, say the state wants to make a law to do with hospitals. If the federal government, for whatever reason, doesn't like that law, too bad, right? Because there is a list of responsibilities for the federal government in Section 51. If, say, the state government wanted to make a law to do with the postal service, or taxes, or lighthouses, for example, if there's no contradicting federal law, right, they still can, but the moment that the federal government goes, oh no, I want to make a law about this, and it overrides that. So, for example, we didn't have a quarantine legislation federally until 1908, even though quarantine is the responsibility of the federal government. So before 1908, the individual states could just make any laws to do with quarantine they want, right? And then the federal government comes in and goes, but that's on our list, and can override it. If it's not on that list, can't override it. Like, the state has that legislative power and that boundary, right? So states actually are kind of pretty powerful. Territories have none of that. So territories can make laws to do with hospitals if the federal government has given them government. So basically territories are anything that's not a state, that's just land that is managed by the federal government, right? So South Australia used to be the whole middle of Australia, and then eventually they're like, we don't like our northern territory, basically. We don't like our northern section. We're going to give it to the Commonwealth, and they can look after it. And for decades, that meant that the people who lived there could not vote. They didn't have, federal representation, and it took until the 70s before they had their own government, their own territory government. And that is a gift from the federal government. It is not constitutionally enshrined. It's not like constitutionally provided to them. It is basically the federal government going, we'll just let you look after yourself to an extent, but anything you do that we disagree with, we are allowed to wind back and repeal, because all this sort of political representation, that is a choice from us. So we're very familiar with the Northern Territory and ACT, because those are the two ones with enough people to have that self-government and get to run themselves. But there are actually 10 territories. Australia has 10. Admittedly, some of them are not populated, like the Australian Antarctic Territory. That's just a couple of scientists. The Coral Sea Islands, that's 4 people on a weather station, just observing birds. But the Cocos Keeling Islands, Christmas Island, Norfolk Island, there are people that live there, but it's only a few hundred, or 2,000, and so the government has been like, no, we're not going to give you your own little parliament. You are just going to be subject to a mixture of federal laws and local laws, and we'll just let the local government of the nearest state sort of look after some things. So it's very much like territories are the responsibility for the federal government, and sometimes the federal government goes, you can look after yourselves, and sometimes the federal government goes, you can't look after yourselves. That the distinction really here is probably just population size, though. It's very, very rare for the federal government to override territory laws. Northern Territory in 1996 legislated for euthanasia, voluntary assisted dying, and the Howard government didn't like that, so just repealed it, but then also made it so that territories could not legislate on that matter, and that ban was only repealed late last year, thanks to Labour and I think the Greens and David Pocock. Whereas states, you can't legislate to stop a state from making laws on that matter, because that's not on the list of Section 51. So that's kind of the distinction, is that the decisions of a state are subject to way less limits, but technically the state and territory governments can make the same laws as each other. It's just that one doesn't have the same sort of solid foundation. But again, it's very rare for the federal government to sort of come in and just be like, no. So that's my long-winded answer. Yes. So, okay. Who is my local member on a state, federal, or local level? Benny, who is my local member? Oh, federally. Wait, are you trying to dox me? Yes, I have met. I've met my local member on a state and federal level. Yeah, I've bumped into them several times because we live in the same area. That's how. Yeah. I don't know how much to say about like interactions with these people because they're actually just like they are human people, you know. Haven't had a very lengthy conversation with them. It's not like I get to go into meetings with them. Though I do encourage people, if you can, try and get a meeting with your local member. Yeah. I mean, like, I did move, but my local member did used to be Simon Nilman, who was the first person I interviewed for Auspol Explained as, like, who was a politician. So I got to go to his office and talk to him about, you know, what state governments do. It's my very first interview. It's not the best, but, you know, it's great. And every now and again I bump into Simon Nilman and he incorrectly tells people that I'm a political reporter for some reason. Like, yeah, close enough, sure. Yeah, I talk about politics and let people know about it. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, what else? Do I think that WA will ever secede, and what will be the main ramifications of that? I don't think so. It's the kind of thing that keeps coming up every now and again. You know, Western Australia was the last state to have a referendum as to whether or not we should join Federation. Did it after the Queen had signed the Constitution. And yeah, like secession has always been in our blood. Like Albany wanted to secede from Western Australia if Western Australia didn't join. And then, you know, then in 1933 we had a state referendum and it passed, but Labor, who came into government because the referendum was the same day as the election, was also like, we don't really want to, but fine, and took that petition to the British government, who was like, yeah, I don't know. Like it says indissoluble Commonwealth, like you'd have to have a federal, like their advice was that you'd have to have a federal referendum for that to succeed, and that just seems like a difficult and weird thing to have, to change the representation of a state. You need a triple majority, so you need more than half the states, so 4 out of 6, the population of that to vote yes, the overall population of all of Australia to vote yes, and then the specific state that it affects. So you'd have to get a majority in Western Australia as well. I don't know, like, is that actually technically the only constitutional way to do that? Because that seems like really difficult for Western Australia to have to campaign for the rest of the country to vote to let them to leave. And like, I think the ramifications of that is that we would not have a great time, to be fair. Like, we have lots of mineral wealth, but states have a it's a vertical fiscal imbalance, where, you know, states look after lots of services, but the Commonwealth has the most taxation powers, so a lot of the services that states look after are funded in part by the federal government, like, you know, schools, hospitals, roads, lots of road grants. Like, I don't know how well it would work financially, because I'm not an economist, but you'd have to sort of trade off, like, what you would lose from federal grants. Could you make that up in sort of new taxes that are WA specific? And then it's like, our share of the GST. That's always a big old gripe, to be like, you know, we won't be sending GST money off to other states, how will that affect the balance sheet? And you'd have to ask someone in the state treasury to do a little mock-up for you. I was just sort of like, should I message someone in the state treasury to see if they could do that? It's probably not. You know what? Leave it with me. I'll figure it out. Cool. Let's catch up with questions. The mandates fight with each other? I'm sorry. You'll have to clarify that question. Do I think that the preferencing system is fair? Particularly in situations where the Liberals are first and the contest is between second and third place, usually Labour and Greens. As an example, Benny. So I like preferential voting. I think it's great. Like before we had preferential voting, we had first past the post, which basically just means, the most popular person without preferences wins, and that's difficult to get a majority when you have like multiple people running. So let's say like in the old system, right? It was like, say someone gets 35% and someone gets 30% and someone gets 25%. Well, the person who got 35% wins. I don't know if that adds up to 100, but that's basically 65% of people did not vote for that person. You have no clue what the other two groups would have voted for. But if you introduce preferencing, right, you can theoretically have almost all the preferences of the second group go, or the third group go to the second group, and then they win because, overall people statistically thought that group was a better option, even though Group A got 5% more votes in terms of first preferences. Now, if you have a massive race with like 12 people, you can get down to situations where someone gets 12.5% of the vote, but everyone else gets way less. And so it's like, well, without preferences, most popular person, right? I think that's first past the post. That's definitely a system. That's definitely the system we had. So preferential voting was actually introduced to stop the Conservatives losing to Labour because the Country Party and the Nationalist Party split the vote. They were competing with each other. And it's like, well, whichever one of us is more popular than the other, yay, we'll get a seat, right? But then Labour comes in and goes, but 30% people voted for the Nationalists and 30% voted for the Country Party, and that leaves 40% for me, right? Ta-da, I win. And so the Conservatives, like the non-Labour forces, put in preferential voting in the aim of defeating Labour. It's a pretty recurring theme in Australia, is that like you can divide things into Labour and non-Labour forces until like the emergence of the Greens, when they have sort of a three-way split. So Labour was against preferential voting for ages. They really argued against it. And now it is actually their friend. It is because, Greens preferences get them over the line. But also they're like, it's also useful for like anyone on any part of the political spectrum because, it encourages you and enables you to vote for any political party you like, whether that is like, one that's only going to get 300 votes or one that's going to get 30,000 votes, because then, hey, if your first preference doesn't win, you still have the ability to sort of rank the other candidates and have a form of expression, right? And it's not just like, your views are unpopular, you're instantly discounted and nothing else you say matters. So, to allow, preferences to exist and shape, elections, it's very useful because it also means that, like if it wasn't that system and you're like, this party that I really like, I could vote for them, but that'll split the vote, or like that'll just be wasted because it's a competition really mostly between these two groups. And, with dedicated and hard work and lots of campaigning, we can get Group 3 a seat, maybe. But let's not risk it and just vote for Group B. You know, like, yeah, preferential voting is a fantastic system in terms of, like, enabling people to have complex expressions and ideas. Okay. Oh. Wow. Okay. Let's all just ignore Ben Chesterton because, you know, he's a troll. Have I? Yes. Let's go. Okay. Let's see. What else is there? Yeah. No further questions at the point currently, but let's talk more about preferential voting. The longest speech in, like, the Senate, it's either, like, the Senate or the House of Representatives. They have two records. One's, like, 12 and a half hours and one's, like, 11 hours or something. And one of them was by a Labour member who disagreed with preferential voting for the reasons that I mentioned, right? It was conceived as a way to allow the Conservatives, the non-Labour forces, to, you know, gang up on Labour and be like, haha, we can defeat them if we have preferences. So this Labour member read out the entire text of the bill line by line to sort of filibuster it effectively, to like just keep talking until his, like, mouth started to bleed or whatever, because he's like, I don't want this to happen and I'm gonna make it unbearable for all of you, and just grind this thing down and stop it for as long as I can. And then the chamber that he was in changed the standing orders to prevent people from being able to talk indefinitely. So filibustering does not exist anymore. I mean, it might on a state or territory level individually, like each chamber has their own rules, but you can't talk for 12 hours straight in Australian parliaments generally. The filibuster is not a thing. If you hear that word, you're probably talking about American politics, but this was, like, back in, like, 1918, so that is a record that literally will not be broken unless something something changes dramatically. Any opinions on digital voting and security concerns? Don't like it personally. Like, that's kind of look, I'm just gonna say Tom Scott has convinced me it's a bad idea. Like, yeah, like, I don't care how uncrackable it is. Like, you know, what if like there is some sort of issue at any point in the process where something glitches or something gets erased, or, like, you know, like a physical paper ballot leaves a physical paper trail, and that is its main advantage. Yeah, like, but also, like, I'm not going to fight anyone over this. Like, if there is, like, a physical machine that has, like, a digital readout, like a print readout of the sort of inputs that you sort of mark digitally, maybe, I guess. I still want a paper trail. I still want physical evidence. But voting over the internet, for example, not a fan of that. I feel like that would be very difficult. But also, like, I understand that there's sort of, you know, ideas that you could try and use it for accessibility purposes. But also, I'm not a tech person, so you'd have to allay my concerns about that, and that would have to be a dedicated and detailed process. You'd also have to amend the Commonwealth Electoral Act for that to happen federally. Yeah. Hey, thank you, Thought Jar Productions, for tuning in. My wife got this shirt from Dangerfield. So if anyone's like, where can I find the shirt that has fairy bread on it? The answer is Dangerfield. Speaking of my wife, I'm just going to make sure she messaged me. Everyone loves it when the person on the stream goes on their phone. Neat. Okay, so, do I think if someone resigns from their party, should they give up their seat? No. Nah. I don't think so. To be honest. A party is not necessary for the function of Parliament. It is an idea that is sort of useful for like group organization, but like they are made up of people. They are made up of factions. So like Labour has their like left and right faction. Liberals have their sort of moderates and their more like hard right people. And you're going to have disagreements within party ranks. Like they have caucus meetings, they discuss things in the party room, they have concerns and problems that they bring to that room, right? So if you have lots of people of a certain faction, that they will probably more likely have ideological ideas that shift one way or another, and if someone gets voted out from one faction, voted in from another, that can help shift the policy of the party over time. But it's also part of party rules to sort of toe the line, right? Like Labour especially, if you disagree with like a particular part of the party policy, well, it's your job to argue that more effectively in the party room. Once it has been determined in the party room, and you go onto the floor of Parliament, and it's like, this is the way we're going to vote, this is the way you vote, until there is some sort of like factional shake-up and differences in who is actually part of the party, and maybe then in the future you get what you want. Like, like Albanese, really worked hard to sort of call for same-sex couples to have sort of the same sort of relationship rights as straight couples. Before it was like an official party policy of Labour, and like Labour people in the past have voted down that, whereas Labour over the years shifted towards endorsing that and calling for it. So like if you're in a political party and you decide, I am consistently having my ideas sort of like outvoted by a different faction, there is these disagreements that keep coming up, or there are some issues that I just cannot agree with, and you decide to like resign, I don't think you should resign from Parliament, because you are a person that got voted in, right? The party is only part of reason why people vote. I'm sure there are people who voted for you as an individual because you had ideas, and the way that you deal with that is a thing for you to determine. And like if there is an example where you decide, no, I think I would be more effective in pursuing the interests of my electorate, the interests and ideology of the people that I represent outside of the political party, you should be completely free to resign and not have your seat terminated. That just would not really seem very democratic to me at all. Okay. Yes, just catching up. Yeah, so, yeah, that's the short of it, It is up to the public whether or not someone belongs in Parliament, right? And if the public decides that you breaking away from your party and expressing different views to them is not agreeable to them, they can vote you out. I think that is the proper course of action for sort of party resignations. I'm not going to answer questions about Barilaro being charged with something. I'm not the court. I don't know. Uh, Tweety Bird asks, do you think that civics should be in the curriculum? It is. It is. I teach it. It's there. Like, it is. It is. I think it's very much like a a thing that people didn't really deal with when I was in high school, but it's definitely a thing that is in there now. And like, it's been a long time since I was in school, so I don't know like what the individual discretion of the teachers is. But you know, like kids start off learning about like the different tiers of government in like year 5 and 6, like, you know, local, state, federal, what do they do, what are the different things, you know, like and like I think year 8 and 9, that's when you're learning about the sort of separate branches like the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature, and you know, this is something that like gets built up, you know, like in year 11 and 12 you're like looking at committees, the like yeah, like when I was in high school, like my sort of like, well, what would you call it? Like civics, society, that sort of general, like it's not math, or English class. Like each teacher I had a different interest, and one just really liked Indonesia, so that's what we learned about. Like it was like geography and history all rolled into one. It's like year 8, you're gonna learn about Indonesia, and then like I think it was year 9. Like the teacher just was like, I just like Australian history. You're gonna learn about like merino sheep and squatters. So like, I don't know. There are definitely teachers out there that don't know much about this and aren't very confident in teaching it. So maybe they just don't. But it's definitely there. It's definitely in the curriculum. It definitely is, and I really hope that more people get more engaged with it. Okay. Sideshow Rupert says, how long till we legalise weed? I don't know. It's up to Parliament. As far as I'm aware, a bill hasn't been introduced. I believe the Greens announced a draft bill. I don't know if they introduced it. Someone could fact check about that. But like, you know, like bills there can be like things like green papers. That's not a pun. You know, where or white papers where it's like, this is part of the consultation process of shaping the legislation before the legislation is introduced, and then it's debated and consulted in Parliament, and it might be sent to a committee for further examination, or it might be voted down, or it might be voted through with or without amendments. And so the hold-up is the general legislative process, and whether or not the Parliament as a whole agrees with that idea. Well, not as a whole, as a majority of Parliament. So I don't know when that's going to happen, but if that is an issue that is concerned to you, like all issues that are concerned to you, I recommend you contact your local member, maybe start a petition. It's not up to me to tell you if or if something should or when it will pass. Anyway, okay, I'm going to try and be quicker now. Someone has asked, Riley has asked about what do I think of the inclusion of the executive government in the voice wording. So basically, right, the voice is an advisory body, and it does that by advising Parliament, but also the executive, which is comprised of ministers. So there is the Minister for Indigenous Affairs, for example, who will be the one who will have sort of delegated legislation and power to make decisions on certain things, right? So, you know, like if there is an Indigenous support group or charity, the minister has sort of regulatory powers over like applications. Can't give you better details than that in this hypothetical I've plucked off my head. But basically, right, you can make a representation to Parliament and the executive, right? Anyone can. That just involves communicating. A petition, for example. But also, like, I'm sure many of you have experienced sending a little email off and then getting nothing. Does it go in the bin? Who knows? Like, they get so many emails, and so the idea of, like, ensuring that it has that direct connection to the Parliament and the executive is just more of ensuring that it gets heard, really. Because otherwise, right, like, they could just, like, the Indigenous voice to Parliament, like, it is theoretically possible for just a bunch of Indigenous people to create a body based off community action and sort of, without any sort of external funding, like, hopefully manage to make a sort of working model. Like, there are Indigenous, like, charities and groups already, and then they can, like, email the Parliament, and then the Parliament might just not respond. But also then that correspondence isn't, like, necessarily, like, a public thing. Whereas, if it's a constitutional like, created body that has access to the executive, right, it means that, like, the minister can't just be like, oh, I don't care about this, I'm not going to meet with them, or, like, our correspondence is going to be private and not transparent in any way, because, like, there's no obligation for ministers outside of Parliament to publish anything that they sort of really do, minus some sort of, like, ministerial standards and specifics on transparency for certain areas. But, like, the Voice, basically, as a constitutional body, will be able to table reports in Parliament. That means that those recommendations and reports are public. Sorry, I'm, like, talking so fast. My voice is... where was I? Yes, so basically it's to ensure that it gets listened to, and then it can table reports as an independent body. Tabling a report makes it public and part of the sort of parliamentary archives, and then the government responds to, and the Parliament can be advised by those reports. So, like, the Auditor General, for example, that's not a legislative body or, like, organisation, but that has sort of this inherent access to the executive and Parliament, because the Auditor General audits government spending and can table reports outside of sitting days and sitting weeks. So, like, that is just a way, one, to have accountability of government, but also advise on, like, how money has been spent. Not in a sort of, like, commenting. The Auditor General doesn't comment on policy, just more of, like, how that money has been spent. So it's kind of like that, I feel. Like, it is just more of an effective way to ensure that it has that access and ability to communicate what it needs to communicate. That doesn't mean that it has any overriding power or force to disagree with the... to enforce any sort of disagreements with the executive. The executive still has, the powers given to the executive. So that's just part of, the efficiency of the body, really, is that inclusion in the constitutional amendment. Anyway, sorry. Gosh. I've finally reached the point where I sort of, like, have to catch up in the chat. What is a treaty for Indigenous people? A treaty is a sort of, like, a legal agreement. What the content of that treaty is in regards to, like, land and sovereignty and relationship and dynamic and laws, etc. that apply. That is up for the treaty itself. And there has been decades worth of trying to get a treaty with Indigenous people in Australia, and that process is an ongoing process, and it just takes a long time. I think Bob Hawke was talking about a treaty with Indigenous people, and that sort of consultation process has just carried on because there are a lot of Indigenous groups, and there's a lot of like, what does a treaty mean? What do we want this to involve? And that dynamic as an agreement takes a lot of time to come to sort of resolution. Okay. Trees. The trees themselves ask me, what is my favourite government tier? I feel like they're all important, but I feel like local government is underappreciated. Like, it's not compulsory to vote in local government in Western Australia, but they're very important because, you know, like, waste management has a lot of impact on, like, the climate change and, like, how we deal with emissions from waste, zoning and subdivisions and like green spaces, like, and park maintenance, like how green is your area? That's not just an environmental concern, that also sort of helps you mentally. Like, what does your space look like that you live in? And a lot of that is managed by local government. Parks and recreation, like, this is pardon me, local government is actually like very, very important. Like, it's the bottom tier, but it's top tier to me, you know? And how it affects your everyday life, I feel goes very underappreciated and undernoticed, because it's like, I don't know. I don't know who my local councillors are. Anyway. Benny asks, do I think the Teal independents will be successful at the next federal election? I don't know. We'll find out. They're all independents, so it's up to the individual electorates. They do have a good amount of funding, though. Climate 200 is funded by not just public donations, but a billionaire. So who knows? I mean, public money and money in elections, as we've seen with Clive Palmer, does not necessarily win you seats, but it is an effective way to get your, money is a useful tool for getting your message out. So I feel like the Teals, it really depends on like Labor's performance in the climate space as to whether or not, like, the electorate will have the sort of same reaction as they did towards the Liberals and their years of frankly not really doing much in that area. So who knows? Like, things change, over time, and it's difficult to predict an election 3 months out. It's very difficult to predict one 2.5 years out. So, yeah. Okay. Crimson Knight, does the Queen really have any power in Australia or not? Well, no, she's dead, but bear with me for a moment. Her presence is with us always. Oh. The King can undo our laws constitutionally within 1 year of them being granted royal assent by the Governor-General. That all of our federal laws are subject to the constitutional power of disallowance in Section 59 of the Constitution. This power has never been used in Australian federal history. Section 59 will not conceivably ever be used. The King will never conceivably practically ever use Section 59 to undo our laws. That is technically something he can do, but, Westminster Convention, it is constitutional convention that the monarch does not act outside of the advice of ministers of state, which are elected members. So I don't know. Why would the government ever advise the king to undo a law? But also, like, would the king agree to that? It would be legal for the king to undo our laws up to 1 year after they have passed. It would still be a constitutional crisis if that happened, because that's defying convention and is a really bizarre thing for them to do. I don't know, the Queen is a bit low. I'm going to save my voice, I'm going to do it again. Okay. From my understanding, First Nations and Indigenous is all sort of... It's one of those, like, either or, you know. Both are, like, encompassing. I tend to say Indigenous because, you know, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders are sort of separate groups. Even Aboriginal is, like, broad, because there was 300 different language groups before colonization, so like everything you say really in reference is an umbrella term. How do I explain COVID? Like, how would you like me to explain COVID? Like, to a child? So there are these things that, like, they're really, really small and you can't see them without a microscope, and they're called viruses, and they make you sick. You know, and COVID is a virus that made lots and lots of people sick, and it still makes lots of people sick, and I don't know, whatever. Sorry, that felt kind of snarky. I don't know. I was just like, that feels like a conspiracy comment, but I don't know. Maybe I was unfair to you. Do I think it would be better to have... Do I think it would be better to not have parties and just be all independents? Parties are, again, not a necessary part of the way Parliament works. That is, like, a choice that has been made, and there have been times in the past where parliaments have been entirely just independents. They've just formed factions. Like, you know, the first several premiers of... You know, most of the states were independents. But the party system sort of just formed eventually. Like, you know, the union movement, the labour movement saw that, like, pardon me, to really change things, to really get, like, action on, like, workplace safety and wages, you know, strikes and industrial action was not the only path, because, you know, that was appealing to you know, ministers in Parliament to be like, hey, this is the thing that we want, will you agree with it or not? Or, you know, or appealing to employers, being like, will you agree with us or not? How much trouble can we cause before you, like, bang us over the head with a police baton and, you know, take us to jail? And so Labour was formed out of that to be like, there needs to be, like, a political branch of this movement to sort of achieve those goals, and having sort of a unified party structure helps with organisation and you know, getting policy that is uniform for multiple areas, and sort of collaborating as a group, as a team. And if you didn't have political parties, you just had independents, you will eventually have factions anyway. You know, people will get into a room and they'll be like, I like these group of people because they have similar ideas to me, and I like those people because they're rude or they don't have the same ideology as me, and you're going to get something that it's kind of like a political party, but it's not. So, like, there's no reason to dislike political parties as a thing. Pardon me. Okay, so how long have how long have I been doing this for? How long have I been doing this for? I've been doing this for an hour. Neat. Benny asks for me to explain pork barreling. Pork barreling. I love R and L words. Basically, pork barreling is where you put money into your electorate. So, like, it's kind of like a bribe, but it's not a bribe because a bribe is a form of corruption, whereas pork barreling is just, coincidentally, you just happened to, within the, powers of your role, manage to just provide more services to a specific area for purposes that might encourage them to vote for you in a way that wouldn't before. Political parties, are meant to service the community. If you are the government, you service all of the community, not just the seats that you have members in, right? But let's say that there is a marginal seat that, a member of your government barely holds, or the opposition barely holds, and you're like, ooh, I think we could flip that if we put in a lot of investment in, infrastructure or some sort of thing like upgrading things and basically just putting more investment and time and effort to put nice things in that electorate, right? In the hopes that, they go, oh, this party has done a great job. Neat. Let's vote for them instead of the other person, right? Whereas, say, the electorate just over, where it's a safe seat, statistically just gets way less attention. And it's like, hey, we also have very similar problems because we're geographically very similar, but it seems like you've given the marginal seat way more money and time and attention for a reason. And that's pork barreling. Where it's like, it's not illegal, it's just, you just wanted to convince one specific group, like, hey, vote for me. I'm gonna build so many things in your electorate, and then the safe seats go, can we have attention? No. That's the practice, basically, of prioritizing marginal seats with investment in the aims of sort of flipping them, instead of targeting marginal seats with investment for the sake of, means tested and based off actual need for what infrastructure and attention that area needs. Okay. Dennis asks, can I tell a story as to how and why the Liberal and National parties formed coalitions? Well, yes. Basically, before it was the Liberal and Nationals, it was the United Australia Party and the Country Party. The Country Party formed in the late 1810s, or was it like 1920? Like, it was like around that time. And it was basically like, hey, we want, like, it was a bunch of farmers, and initially it was like, we can be independents, and then, oh, wait, we'll form a political party, because that's what happens. There was basically a hung parliament in 1922, 1921, something like that, where, basically, like, UAP and Labour, they were forming into the two major groups, and, like, they were trying to, like, compete for a majority. But then all of a sudden, like, this Country Party emerged and took these seats, and so there was this three-way split that hadn't happened in over a decade. And the Country Party was like, we will give you, the UAP, supplying confidence, right? Earl Christmas Page, negotiated, being like, hey, wait, it wasn't the UAP at that point, it was the Nationalists, wasn't it? Oh, I can't remember. Yeah, I think it was the Nationalists, not the UAP. I think that's if we go even further back. But yeah, he was basically like, hey, you know, basically, we'll vote with you. We'll give you the seats to get a majority, in terms of like, but we want concessions, and also part of the ministry. And remarkably, a completely uneven amount. Like, they got way more minister positions than was proportional to the vote that they got, or seats that they got. But it was like, hey, do you want to govern or not? So that is like the formation. Like, Earl Page really sort of started that coalition, and those two groups, those two non-Labour groups, evolved into now the Liberal Party from 1945 and the National Party, which is just the continuation of the Country Party, just renamed a couple of times, and that is how the coalition was formed. In the 20s. To sort of gang up against Labour. If you examine the history of Australian politics, it is Labour and non-Labour. Labour has existed since the 1890s, and it has just been like other groups sort of amalgamating. We had competing groups before then, like the protectionists and the free trade, which became sort of anti-socialist party, and then there was the fusion that happened to sort of bring those groups together, and we had sort of like the what was known as the Commonwealth Liberal Party, and that was like, we can work together to stop Labour getting a majority if we just keep teaming up together, and that has stuck since, basically. And now, like in Europe, for example, lots of parliaments have like times where like no one's going to get a majority, so you have your two major parties, and you just have a coalition of like two or three other minor parties that like prop up that major party to just get over the line or whatever after an election, and you sort of, sometimes those like move around, but like since 1940, like that was the last election where, besides 2010, where it was a hung parliament, like we really solidified that the coalition, the Liberals and Nationals, fight Labour, and those two groups get to basically choose who is government. The Liberal Party heavily relies on that. The Liberal Party has only ever, in 3 times ever, gotten enough seats by themselves to govern without the help of the National Party. They cannot govern outside of the coalition. That is not a thing, except for in specific states, like, say, South Australia, where there isn't really much of a regional population, and so, the Nationals just don't have a sort of presence, or, like, they don't really get seats. Same with Tasmania. But, like, Queensland, where the two parties fused, or, like, New South Wales, for example, the Liberals need the coalition. They need the Nationals to govern, because it statistically is just not likely for them to do so otherwise. And so it was a quirk of what happened, an uprising in the early 20s that like led to this. Yes, Yommel, this is a Fairy Bread shirt. It is from Dangerfield. My wife got it for me. Drinky Bill asks about working for a political party. You'd ask them. Just email them. There's all sorts of things that political parties do. I don't know what you do, but like, maybe it might be useful for them. You could just like volunteer around election time to help with like door knocking or how to vote cards or talking to people. Doesn't necessarily mean that you have to have a job for them if you support them, but also like they do lots of things. So I don't know, contact them. Political parties tend to have like careers sections to their websites sometimes, and advertise like, we need a new social media manager, or like, policy advisor, or something. But it is like definitely like, contact them, contact their office, find out what they need, and if you can fit that bill in some way. Okay. 'Cause, 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 No, it's definitely fairy bread, not pizza. Sorry. Sorry, Fabs. I do not do political news. That requires too quick of a turnaround, and I can't. I barely keep up with this channel with my job as is. I recently did just do like a little. I filmed a collab with Channel 6 News Australia yesterday. That's run by a 15-year-old, but he's interviewed Anthony Albanese, which is one more Prime Minister than I've interviewed. So I don't know if he interviewed Scott Morrison. Basically, the dude has done more interviews and more impressive stuff than I have, and he's 15. And he just talks about Australian politics and news. It's like a little journalist. He's a little journalist in real life. That's... But yeah, I don't know. Also follow like the ABC, etc. What are my thoughts on question time? Is it valuable or just a chance for the parties to sledge each other? I think it is valuable. It is. Where is the water? Break for a moment. So, like, people tend to see question time as, like, a yelling fest. That's kind of what happens a lot of the time. That's certainly the bit that gets... broadcast, but I've seen plenty of question times where no yelling happens and it's kind of boring, like from a theatre perspective. But like, no, it is actually genuinely helpful because Parliament has a structure. Like, it has a very structured structure, right? Like, you can't just like get up and talk about whatever you want at any point in time. Like, there is like the notice board, there is the order of the day. We are talking about this bill, right? We're going to be talking about government business here. There will be brief ministerial statements here. There will be a time to present petitions here. There are a lot of things that, you know, unless it is your turn to talk, you don't engage in debate at that point. You know, it is waiting your turn. And so, like, you know, there's members' statements as well, where they can talk about anything they want and bring attention. You know, there's grievances as well, where a member, like, can bring up things with a minister. That's the time for, you know, a member, even of the government party, to be able to ask directly and bring up an issue with a minister. You know, like, on the floor, and have like a public response to that, and bring that concern, you know, into the chamber. But it's like, this is also, you know, most of the time, not everyone is always in the chamber. So question time is the time where, you know, people are dedicated, definitely in there, outside of like certain debates or like division votes, you know, and even though it can devolve into a yelling fest, this is a time for the opposition to bring up concerns outside of the regular sort of structure of debate. Like, it's not like, oh, you know, we're talking about farming regulation, but I really want to talk about, you know, something else. Where do I bring it up? Where do I mention it? You know, sure, like, the questions are often very loaded. Like, the opposition asks very hard-hitting questions, like, you know, do you accept that it's an utter failure that you haven't done X, Y, and Z, and will you resign if you cannot meet X target by blah, blah, blah? And the government gets to go off and sort of like criticize the opposition or try and defend themselves. But still, you know, it's up to the opposition what kind of question they ask, and it's up to the government, backbenchers, up what kind of question they ask, and like, it doesn't necessarily need to just be like slinging hate at each other. It really can be about bringing up an issue and a concern and forcing the government to come up with some kind of response to something. Like, you can highlight a scandal or a perceived scandal, and then that's public record. And if the government doesn't have a good response, you know, you as the opposition member can then take that back to the electorate or to the media and be like, this is what they said, you know. they're clearly like skirting around the issue or blah 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 blah. You know, like this is a time to voice concerns and bring up issues that you know, wouldn't neatly work into the ordinary structure of any particular given day, and even if that does not result in necessarily constructive debate, it doesn't result in debate. It's question time. You do not debate in question time. Like, you know, it's publicly recorded. It's broadcast. It's reported on, and you can use that as sort of like either finding out information or a starting point for a future campaign or issue or concern that the opposition or even government backbencher wants to bring up. So, yeah. Question time is fun sometimes, but it is also actually genuinely useful also sometimes. Yeah. Okay. I have been talking for a while, so I will wrap this up in, I don't know, like 15 minutes. But let's go talk about the other things that people are saying. I don't know about the history of unions in Perth. Sorry, Jay Ryan. I only know so much. What are the legal requirements for a state to secede from the Commonwealth, Michael? Oh, I believe a referendum. I mentioned earlier, I think, you know, for a state to actually legally secede properly and fully, the Constitution does say it is an indissoluble Commonwealth comprised of the following 6 states. Pardon me. So, in theory, I think that means that you would have a referendum, a nationwide one, where you get, you know, the rest of the country to agree that you should be able to secede. Technically, I mean, like, I don't know how else you would do that. You should email, you know, a constitutional lawyer and be like, hey, how does this work? Yeah. Like, the West Australian State Constitution says that the monarch can subdivide the land in ways of her choosing, but that just means, like, that doesn't mean seceding, that just means, like, taking part of, say, Western Australia and being like, this is now Queensland too, because I like it. But also that is in the West Australian Constitution is before the federal one was created, so I think the federal one would basically just supersede that, and you'd have to argue that in the Supreme/High Court, which I will not do. So the answer is probably just the referendum for the entire nation, maybe, and I don't know what other mechanism would be legally recognisable. So, sorry to all those Hutt River Province, Principality Hutt River fans out there. Sorry, it's not real. I'm the Principality of Hutt River fan out there. I have like 2 books back there on it. I have like stamps. I feel like if I turn, I feel like I had some, like literally right here of like stamps or something from the Hutt River Province. Oh well. Who is Peter? What is this? Why do people keep saying Peter? I'm David. This is anyway. Okay. Comparison and Australia and America. Go. Gov. Thanks. Ours is a parliamentary system based off the Westminster system in Britain, and the US is different somehow. Their executive is really sort of like just right up there in the legislative branch. Like governors, our state governors, sort of as representatives of the monarch, work more sort of functionally to ensure the mechanics of Parliament keep running, even though they are technically part of the legislative branch. They don't have legislative agendas, so they don't, like, the governors don't be like, you should have a bill about blah blah blah, whereas the governors of states in America, like, get elected instead of appointed, and they're like, I'm gonna make it so this state does insert issue here. I'm sure you can all think of a thing in the US that is an issue with governors and politics there. Yeah, I don't know. Also, gerrymandering is a thing in the US where they alter their districts, the electoral districts, to have the most absurd boundaries to ensure that their demographics are more statistically likely to vote a specific way or not. That was a previous concern in Australia. Joe Bielke-Peterson, got a book about him back there. He was involved in doing some of that. They called him, what do they call it? I think they had a little joke for like a pun on gerrymandering. But yeah, now the AEC and its state relevant bodies are independent bodies that do redistributions every several years based off demographic and population shifts instead of government gerrymandering stuff. I don't know. The US is several layers of different to Australia. Anyway. Yes, my name is David, not Peter. People, I've had professional people, like tradies, I've talked to people, via email, and they've replied with Peter. I sign off with David. My email has David in it. I say things like, hello, fellow David. There was a guy who did some stuff for my house, and his name was David, and he called me Peter, and I'm like, no, we're both called David. What are you talking about? Oh dear. Okie dokie. Well, so much. I feel like the more detail I go into about comparing the US and Australia, I'm just gonna get it wrong. But a pretty big obvious difference is the fact that they have a president and not a prime minister. So a president is the head of state, and the prime minister is head of government, and those are two separate things. So our head of state is, I've forgotten which way it's was the Queen, is now King Charles III. He's our head of state, and the Governor General acts on behalf of that. Whereas the US president is head of state and head of government, all wrapped into one, and is elected in a, if you say directly elected, someone will try and correct you to be like, well, the Electoral College actually just proves that's wrong, and the popular vote is difficult for the Republicans to win, so they love the Electoral College and how it skews things in their favour. We do not have that system. We do not directly elect the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister is an appointed person who leads the party that forms government. Government is whoever has confidence in the House, which is usually done by forming majority. I'm mentally slipping now. I'm blanking. But yeah, basically, think of the Governor General as like a president who doesn't go on the news and tell you that he wants to build a wall, because that's not his job. The president signs bills into law in the US and also can veto them, and there's a whole back and forth with Congress if that happens. Whereas technically the Governor General can veto bills, can just not sign them, but doesn't. Has never outright refused to sign a bill in Australian history, and that's not a power that they exercise, because that is not the convention, and that's not the purpose of the Governor General, even though that is a reserve power in a constitutional crisis that they can exercise if need be, and that's a pretty big distinction. And I think that sort of lack of understanding of how the Governor General and President are kind of like the same person, just one has more responsibilities and power because they're combined with the head of government. I think a lack of understanding of that is really the a big source of people's hesitancy when it comes to sort of the Republic movement, because they see, oh, you want to get rid of the monarch and have a president? You mean like Trump or Biden? No, not even remotely. No, that has not been the proposed model for an Australian Republic. I'm sure some people out there think that is a great idea. They would definitely, I believe there was actually a voice calling for that in the constitutional sort of conventions leading up to the 1999 referendum, but it was not the model. That was not the dominant one, and it was very quickly outvoted in the conventions. So the idea of a directly elected president or a US-styled president was not the idea that we had in the 1999 referendum, and I cannot imagine that would be the one brought to us in the sort of referendum that Labor wants to have in 2026, I think, is when they want to have one. So, yeah, just always remember, right? If we are to become a republic, it is almost likely not to be like the US. It's more likely just to sort of make the Governor-General have sort of codified powers instead of conventional powers, and have a sort of similar role, maybe a different way of having them chosen, maybe a mixed appointment, mixed elected, or, that's for us to learn in the future when a future model for a republic is put forward through a bill and then referendum. But yes, that's a big thing that I always want to point out, because I love correcting people. No, because I want people to be accurate in their understanding of politics, and concerns over a republic being like the US is not an accurate concern. That is a personal disagreement with that model, or personal endorsement of that model, depending on your politics, but is not what is likely to happen with Australia, unless things really, really change in the sort of public mood, and lots of people campaign for that. That is possible. People can campaign for that if they want. If that is a concern to you, contact the, Assistant Minister for the Republic? Labor has some sort of, position for, working on developing a future Australian Republic. So if you have thoughts, look up whoever that person is and contact them. Who was the most important Peter in Australian politics? Well, Peter Costello was the longest serving treasurer under Howard, and therefore had a massive impact in how Australia has been shaped in the sort of modern era, because of a lot of austerity cuts and budget spending, cutbacks to public services, and sort of creating this culture of tax cuts that Peter Costello and John Howard really championed, moving away from the sort of economic model that Malcolm Fraser championed, and sort of the more Keynesian, I don't know how to pronounce it, model of sort of Robert Menzies as well. Robert Menzies actually had 9 budget deficits in a row, and he's like, that's fine because I'm investing and growing Australia in a post-World War II boom, whereas sort of Peter Costello and John Howard were very much sort of the more conservative economic, modern conservative economic ideas of lower government spending. Well, they said that, but to be fair, government spending actually rapidly increased under Howard, faster in a 4-year period than the decade prior. He actually massively increased spending, but it's more accurate to say that his economic model was about cutting spending on public services, not cutting spending overall. Government spending was actually pretty high under Howard and Costello, but also so were the sort of structural deficits brought on by tax cuts to the rich, and this culture of tax cuts to the rich has persisted, both in now Tony Abbott and Joe Hockey, and this idea of cutting back services that we saw under more recent coalition governments, and now even the idea of more tax cuts are good is now even part of Labor's platform, as they've sort of agreed to the stage 3 tax cuts. that'll sort of put people in the $45,000 to $200,000 bracket in the same tax bracket. Like, that's a pretty big impact on like shifting sort of the economic model and approach to how we sort of govern things. Like, very different economic ideas from the previous decades, and how that sort of has been effectively marketed to the point where, you know, Labour, who previously would have ideologically opposed that, now fully endorses that sort of idea of tax cuts to higher brackets. They don't agree with the same sort of level of cutting back of government spending on public services. That's always been like Labour's thing of spending government on like government services. But yeah, that's definitely, I feel like, you know, a big shift. And also was the first Peter I could think of. I still can't think of another Peter, and it's really fortunate that I managed to pluck that one off the top of my head. I'm sure if we think harder, we can find a more influential Peter, maybe. I don't know. Okay. Crimson Knight asks, how much does money matter in politics? I don't know. I mean, money is definitely an important thing. There are lots of like micro parties, minor parties that just simply don't get funding, and that just makes it difficult for them to reach electors. You know, if you can't like print out things or pay for advertising, you know, it's very difficult to communicate your message without a lot of you know, grassroots volunteer support. But also on the flip side, Clive Palmer spent more than like Labour, Liberals, Nationals and Greens combined, and he managed to get you know, 0 seats in the he got 0 seats, the UAP, in the 2019 election, and then has a single senator who basically is there because, you know, someone has to fill the last spot, and he is the most popular of the list of people who did not get enough votes to get a quota in the Senate otherwise. Whereas legalized cannabis, you know, they're not exactly well funded, but they got 2 seats in the New South Wales Legislative Council, last I checked. They've got 2 in the WA Legislative Council. You know, like, money is not everything. Like, it's not a direct thing for like your electoral performance, but it's also true to say that money is important and influential. You know, like, political donations do have an impact on policy. That is something that is you know, was found by a Senate inquiry. I can say that that's not me having a personal negative opinion about Parliament. That is a thing that Parliament itself has reported on and has tabled a report saying that it does have an influence. So take that. Like, also, we all can say, of course, money has, and political donations has an influence on policy. You know, what that extent is arguable. But yeah, you know, it's not everything, because politics is people, and people need to care about your issues for you to get anywhere. But it's also true to say that if you have 0 money whatsoever, you will get nowhere, especially because there is a registration fee to create a political party and sort of run in an election. So you need at least a few $1,000s. But yeah. So it's one of those things. Money, it's good to have some, but it will only get you so far. But also, you need it to enter the race. Anyway, look, I did say that we would finish up in about 15 minutes, and it's been 18, so I think it is time for us to go to sleep. No? Unless some of you are in, like, I don't know, New Zealand. Actually, I was like, no, it's like not even 8:30 in New South Wales. Everyone, it's time for bed. Beddy buys. It's me, Fat Cat. It's past 7:30 in most time zones in Australia, and it's time for the weird little jingle. If anyone my age remembers that. I don't know, is Fat Cat still on TV? I don't watch live broadcast TV, but, like, is Fat Cat still a thing at, like, 7:30 to be like, hey, kids, time for sleep? But he doesn't say that because Fat Cat is mute. Isn't he? I think he is. again, it's been a long time since I've, one, watched live broadcast TV, and two, been a literal child, so... yeah. Okay. Quick little question about no, I'll answer your question about the Senate and Legislative Council, and then I can leave. Basically, I don't know. I mean, the rules will vary from parliament to parliament, but as of the 77 referendum, it's basically up to the state parliament to, as applicable and practical as possible, put forward a replacement for a senator that is the same political party as the one that was elected. So basically, it's well, people voted for this political party, we will put forward someone. And the thing is that because the Senate is 6 people elected across an entire state, you can't really have a simple by-election like you can for a single seat in the House of Representatives. It's having a statewide election to fill a vacancy, 1/6 of a vacancy in a multi-member electorate is difficult and costly, and it's not a practical thing. So the idea of the state parliament, works to nominate effectively and validate a replacement for that casual vacancy is just an efficient way to do that, and to ensure that it is a person from the same political party as practical as possible, ensures that the sort of ideological balance that that most recent election went to is maintained. Before 1977, that was not a requirement, and so Joe Bjelke-Petersen from Queensland really used that to his advantage, and it was him in New South Wales to sort of really screw Gough Whitlam over. But yeah, I believe legislative councils, they do it differently. I don't know the rules of every single legislative council, but the Western Australia recently had a member of the Legislative Council resign, the Honourable Alana McTiernan. Yes, she would be called honourable because she's a MLC in WA. And basically, yeah, they did just continue down the ticket of Labor's most last election. So the Honourable Ben Dawkins got elected. Elected, sort of, basically got to fill that Legislative Council vacancy. So it wasn't, the party didn't choose that. The party, Labor Party, actually would have preferred not for that to happen, because Ben Dawkins is the subject of a restraining order and some serious it's basically, the short answer is crimes that you can look up, but crimes that don't invalidate him from being in Parliament, because there is a sort of threshold to get, and so the party didn't have a choice in that. That was based off the candidates on the ballot. It is basically just he wasn't actually the next one on the ticket. The person in between him and Alana McTiernan was I don't want to take up my seat. I want to focus on my business that is currently working on. So it was basically based off how would it have resolved if there was a vacancy at that election. So that is different from the Senate, the federal Senate versus a state's legislative council. Different rules. I don't know how the legislative councils of other states do it, but that's basically a long way to answer your question, is that they do that sometimes, depending on which state and chamber it is. There's different ways to replace a member who is vacant. What are the powers of the electoral commissions, Michael? Electoral commissions don't have much power. They have the power to run elections and by-elections. They don't have powers to sort of regulate truth in political communications. They have a disinformation register. There is sort of If someone does something like, hands out how to vote cards that clearly like lie to you about how voting mechanically works, then like the Electoral Commission can get involved in that, but it has very limited jurisdiction as to what it would have a say on. It is there to ensure that an election happens and that you can vote, and it is up to the people running to say what is reasonable within the confines of like the law outside of the Electoral Commission. I thought of and then forgot something that I was going to say about the AEC. Oh yeah, it's also to be a member, to be a candidate in an election, you sign a sort of statutory declaration, about the accuracy of your application, and the AEC is not the arbiter of truth. So as long as you've filled it out correctly, you can be a candidate. But if they suspect that there is something that is inaccurate about it, that would violate that statutory declaration, because you're not meant to lie, they can then refer it on to the Australian Federal Police, which is a thing that Rodney Culleton had to deal with. A former Senator Rodney Culleton for the Great Australia Party, who is has committed a couple of crimes in the past and is an unresolved insolvent. So he's bankrupt, basically, which means that he's ineligible to be in the Senate, but he consistently keeps trying to be a candidate for Senate elections. He also has a whole thing about like the courts aren't real and stuff. It's some very fascinating reading if you want to go on his website, but the AEC was like, well, technically we can't we can't like turn down your application to be a candidate because you've filled in all the boxes, but we do strongly suspect that you have lied about your eligibility, so we're going to refer it on to the Australian Federal Police, and they, as a body, will like actually investigate and have the powers to do things. So don't lie on your applications, basically. It's not the AEC's job to enforce that, but they can, put that paperwork off to someone else who does have the ability to sort of enforce that. Okay, I really will wrap up very, very soon. I'm just going to catch up with how the chat is going. Oh, gosh. Hi, Will. Sorry that you've just popped in. I'm about to leave. Okay. Hi, Jaden. What does my channel cover? Australian politics. As in, like, more of, like, this system of how things work. Like, the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly or the House of Representatives. They're the person who makes sure everything runs smoothly within the chamber. Or like, how does election work? How does preferential voting work? You write numbers in boxes. This is how it works. This is what it means. That sort of thing. I don't really talk about policy unless it's absolutely necessary for illustrative purposes. So, yeah, I'm not gonna... I'm not going to tell you if policy is a good idea or a bad idea. There are other YouTubers who do that. I'm not one of them. Pardon me. Neat. Well, pardon me. It is time for me to go and burp, apparently, and hiccup. It's time for me to go have dinner and save my voice. It's been fun talking to you all for, wow, an hour and 45 minutes nearly. Yeah, but it is time for me to wrap up and say goodbye and have dinner and relax. No, Ishval, I don't want to run for government because that requires so much effort. Members of Parliament, they actually have really long working hours. People think that members of Parliament are lazy and they don't have to do much. That's not true. It's not a 9-to-5 job. Sometimes members are in the chamber at 3 a.m, arguing things. I don't like to go to bed past 11:30. I don't want to be in a caucus meeting at like 9 a.m. I don't want to have to travel across the country back and forth and not see my wife for ages. Even like, state government, that still involves lots of traveling. Ugh. And long meetings. Too much effort. And even if you're doing a good job, someone out there hates you. Because, you know, people have different ideas. No matter how good of a job you do, no matter which political party you are or an independent, someone out there thinks you're the devil. And I don't want to do that. I would rather everyone love me and adore me, which is way easier if you, you know, are a YouTuber who doesn't talk about policy. That still somehow manages to get people who hate me. They're like, blah, 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 blah. I don't like you for insert political reason here. It's like, I literally didn't talk about that, but okay. So, yes. Anyway. Neat. So, yes, it is ending. Sorry, Jacob. Yeah. Kaya, but farewell. Kaya is welcome in the local Noongar language, by the way. I didn't just, like, mispronounce what you said in the chat. But, yes. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining and asking me questions. So, just to reiterate, no, I don't want to be a politician, but I do encourage you to contact members. Anyway, my name is David, not Peter, and I will see you all in the future. Look forward, next week I will have a video all about the role of the monarchy, its history, its powers in Australia, and how those powers have evolved over time. You know, some of those powers, they've, like, legally changed. Some of those powers have just conventionally changed to just not be used anymore, even though they still legally and constitutionally exist. So, you know, get excited for next week. You're going to learn, hey, what can King Charles III do if he really wants to do things? And then, in 2 weeks' time, have fun with his coronation. I'm looking forward to it. I really am. I'm literally holding a watch party at my house with friends for King Charles III's coronation because I am that kind of person. Yeah. So, good night, everyone. Good night. I'll see you next time. And then comes the fun part of like, oh, how do I turn this off? Oh, I'm so old. I'm like 31. Oh, how do you